Hi, folks. Hey, up here. You guys over here, if you want to see the panel, you can move down this way. Otherwise, enjoy your laptops on that side. Welcome to the Browser Perspective Panels. I'm Mike Schroepfer. I'm your moderator for today. We've got 3 great panelists here representing a variety of viewpoints on where browsers are going. We've got Charles, who's been working on standards for about 10 years. For the last 4 years, he's been working with Opera software on part of the W3C, part of many of the emerging web standards. Let's welcome Charles to the panel. Yay! Save that for later. Next to Charles, we have Jonas. Jonas has also been working for browser technologies for about 10 years. First as a Mozilla community member, and now for the last several years as a full-time Mozilla developer, been concentrating in the DOM and also a participant in many W3C working groups. Welcome, Jonas. And Ian is a product manager on Google Chrome. He's been with the team since 2007. He works on core infrastructure, security, and focuses a lot of his time on HTML5 and emerging web standards, and has been an active participant again in the web standards working group. So welcome to our panel, Ian. All right, so I'd like to kick it off with a couple of questions, and then we'll definitely open up to the audience to see what things you are curious about. We'll start with you, Charles. I'm curious as to what you think the most promising emerging standard is on the market and why you're excited by it.
It's a tough question. I think one of the things that I'm really excited by, Doug wants me to say SVG, which is what I was going to say. But I think that's pretty much emerged, and it's out of the closet. The access to device information, the location, the camera, the SMS, the address book stuff. And the reason I'm really, really excited about it is because it makes us get security right. It's like if you start telling the web where people are and who they talk to and what their device does, you've got to get security right in a way that we've never really done before. And doing that means we can really go out and make cool things and let them run. So I think that's probably one of the most exciting things happening right now.
So, Jonas, if you could make every other browser vendor implement one standard today, what standard would that be?
I would probably say one of the things I would really like to see is OGG support for the video tag.
Yes.
Having free video on the web is very, very important, and it's also a standard where we don't yet have. Everyone is behind the video tag, and that's very good, making it easier for people to put video on the web without relying on things like Vimeo or YouTube is really good. But also allowing people to do it for free is very important. With standards like H.264, for example, there's a big risk that everyone that puts a video on the web is going to have to pay money, and that as Mozilla, we have really worked for making it easy and cheap to put stuff on the web.
Okay. So, Ian, bringing this to you, if you could uninvent a standard that's in existence today, which standard would you uninvent?
So I think if I could uninvent a standard, what I would uninvent is things that are sort of de facto standards but not actual standards. There's a lot of these things out there that cause problems for us sort of alternative browsers, if you will. One great example of this is ActiveX. It's not an actual standard that we all sat down and agreed upon, but yet a lot of people, especially in the Asian regions, like if you're looking at e-banking in Korea, Japan, China, they're all using ActiveX controls, which isn't something that we can support on Mac and Linux. It's not something that we all sat down and tried to figure out what's the best API for this, how do we do it the best way. So I think a lot of these things that are sort of proprietary standards that never really made it through the web standards process, I would love to see us have an opportunity to go back and figure out, what are we actually trying to support here? How can we do this in an open way that everyone can implement securely, implement cross-platform, and just do in a more webby, standards-friendly way?
Okay, I've got an open question for the panel, so whichever of you would like to respond. If I'm a web developer, so I'm building websites, for example, and I wanted to talk to the browser vendors and lobby on behalf of a particular new standard or a change in implementation to be done, how do I get in touch with you? How do I help influence the process by which you decide what you're going to build in the next version of the browser that affects the entire web ecosystem?
So the dumb answer is email, right? Because we all read a lot of it. I think part of the smart answer is you get your users to become very visible. You know, if you've got something that you're building, then show that it's interesting, because the browsers actually look around at what's going on in the web. A lot of the input to things that we're going to do in standardization comes from things that people are trying to do and getting frustrated by. So building it, and then instead of hoping they will come, because eventually we will, but building it and then going to talk to us and say, this is what I want, you know, and do it at somewhere like, you know, go and talk to the W3C, the working group, or submit it to a relevant group where a bunch of browser makers and a bunch of the other parts of the ecosystem are already present, because it's not just browsers. You've got to have browsers. You've got to have the tools that people are going to use. If you build something, if we build some format and you can't make authoring tools for it, then we've got a problem, right? Because you've got a bit of the ecosystem missing. But basically, make it and then find the forum we're sitting in where we talk about this stuff. 3D Canvas is an example of something where, we went to a place, we ended up at Kronos, which seemed to be a reasonable organization. We would like it to be more open in the way it works, but it's got the right people working on the right technology, and Mozilla, Opera, people out in the wild world all went and said, we want to do 3D stuff. Let's go and do it together.
Yeah, I think showing that there is a need for something is a very good way of building support for, or ensuring that browsers will get excited to implement something. There's an infinite number of suggestions, and it's very rare that someone sends in a suggestion to a standards body or to a browser, just shoots away one email, and then everyone gets so excited about that idea that people start implementing it. It has happened, and it's usually very small things, but more what happens is that you do the best you can without it. So for example, with 3D, as soon as Canvas came out, people started doing like Doom and 3D games in Canvas. And it's horribly slow, but it sort of works. You can sort of see potential there. And so people did the best they can with the tools that were there, and thereby showed that if we only had this other tool as well, we could do the things we're doing, but more awesome. So that is a very good way of getting browsers and getting standards organization to take interest, is to show that there is an actual need for it.
I know a lot of people, if I could just answer quickly, I know a lot of people out here look at us up here and see like Google, giant company, Mozilla, big browser, Opera, big player, been around for quite a long time. I think probably one of the oldest browser?
Well, yeah, I think we're now the oldest browser in active development and still around.
So people look at us and think like, oh my gosh, they must have a ton of resources and giant teams to work on all of these. But the reality is that we do sort of have to pick and choose. We're looking at, what are people actually trying to do, as Jonas and Charles said. The other side is that, for Chrome at least, and Mozilla as well, we're open source. If you really want to see something implemented, patch is welcome. Go to dev.chromium.org. All of our source code's there. We're all hanging out on IRC and pound Chromium on Freenode. You can come talk to us and pitch an idea and say, like, look, this is this really cool thing I want to do. And by the way, I implemented it. Here you go. Check it out. That's a great way to get it in there, too.
It turns out that there's no shortage of things that we could be working on. It's about what are the ones that are really important to the world. So, just implementing code, it's like, is one part of a step that you can do, but showing that this is something that is going to be important to the world, that this matters to other people, is a pretty critical step to get something to be a standard and not a private project.
So turning the question around, what as browser developers do you wish more web developers were doing to take advantage of next generation technologies in existing or upcoming browsers? What do you wish you saw on the web?
It's really awesome when you put the new technology, even if you especially when you put it in an alpha or beta release, and to see people start playing around with it and do amazing things that you had just never imagined that people would do with it, like with the Canvas when that came. So playing with early alphas and betas is a really good way. And also, these people tend to find bugs, and these are bugs that we can fix before the release. And this prevents things where there was a bug in an initial release, and now everyone has to deal with that bug, and we can't fix it because people have started depending on it. Fixing those things before, because people find them in alphas and betas, is really, really nice. Also, just like pushing the limits, daring to do demos at least that only work with one browser. I can understand the reluctance, and I do want people to develop sites that work in all browsers, but at least playing around with technologies that only exist in one browser, not necessarily Firefox, but you're welcome to do that too. But people playing around with new technologies and doing things that we had never imagined is really cool.
Sorry, go, Ian.
I mean, I think we talk a lot about this chicken and egg scenario, and I don't know if you're the chicken or if you're the egg, but a lot of us want to think that, the other person needs to do something first. And I think that really we just need to act. So on the Google Chrome team, we're starting to look at CSS3 and vertical text. Is anyone really using vertical text right now? No, not really, but on the other hand, there's no option to do it. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to do it. And I would love it if some of you content publishers out there would go ahead and start implementing vertical text on your site, even though it might not work yet, because when it does, there's going to be a lot of users, like Japan, surprised. They wake up in the morning and their newspaper is still vertical. It hasn't changed. Their language hasn't changed just because the web has some restriction. So we're working on lifting those restrictions. I would say that what would really help me is if you guys would start working on the parts that you have control over, such that when we're both there, it'll just work. And I think that the first time that someone wakes up and they see, oh my gosh, Wikipedia is now vertical in Japanese. It's like reading it in a newspaper. Oh my gosh, this webcomic now has vertical text, just like the manga I read on my table. I think that's going to be a very sort of eye-opening moment. And after that happens, it'll accelerate demand, and people will start creating more content. More browsers will start implementing. And so I would say just forget the whole chicken and egg argument and just do it.
So I'd also like to say, figure out the experimental stuff. And get all of the experimental toys and play with them and push them and make experiments and show us where this thing can go and show us where we should be thinking next and give out all the new ideas and figure out how to separate the experimental stuff and the hacking around from building ordinary stuff. Ordinary stuff should be built right. So, if you're building a piece of crazy experimental sculpture to show off what can be done with a material, you build a crazy thing. If you're building a bridge, get the standards right. Figure out how to do it properly and use the technology that we've got properly. And that's really important, because the more time we spend messing around with existing broken rubbish, the less time we spend doing interesting things. And that frustrates our engineers who like making cool stuff rather than patching bad HTML. And it frustrates the developers because the browsers spend all their time patching bad HTML instead of giving more interesting functionality.
So one of the challenges of pushing new standards in browsers is getting those new browsers adopted on users' desktops. I'm sure as anyone in the audience who's building a major website probably still has to support both IE6 and Firefox 2, because together they're a reasonable portion of their user base. What are all of you doing to aggressively get your users to upgrade to the latest version of the browsers that have the latest and newest standards?
Ooh, I can answer that. If you're running Google Chrome, you're running the latest version, which I know Firefox does some auto updates, not quite as aggressively as Chrome, but I think that there's certainly a good case to be made for doing automatic updates, and I'd like to see more people move towards that direction. It helps keep the web browsers up to date, and that's good not only from a functionality and standards perspective, but also when there's a security bug that we patch, we're able to push out an update, and it goes out to the vast majority of our users very quickly. So I'd really like to see more browsers.
Have a look at Opera 10. It's got auto update in it.
Yeah.
There are some issues with auto update, right? There are issues about systems, people who run very secured systems, or systems where, for some reason, they want to have a lot of control. You don't put the space shuttle onto the beta version of anything, right? So, and there are other places where you don't want to update everything automatically. If you use a browser twice a week and you pay a lot of money for your data, you don't want the browser costing you $10 a week because that's $5 a page. You should be able to turn the update off. You should be in control. But yeah, auto-update, making it easy for the user to just have the thing that is the latest version is important. Making the latest version actually better quality. Make sure that it's an improvement and that it's a real upgrade and not we made a new version and you should have it anyway. Because if you do that a couple of times, people say, well, wait a minute, you guys don't necessarily improve. I don't want to upgrade. So that attention to quality, getting stuff right, is important.
I think there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to pushing the latest version automatically. It is scary when to push a new major release, because there's always going to be some amount of things that break with a new major release. If you fix a bug, a site is going to break. That's just how the web works. So pushing new major releases, we're talking a lot about how to do that. I think it's very important for security updates. It's very important that it's because they come so often that it's important that it's very smooth and it's unnoticeable for the user, so the user doesn't get bothered, because nothing really should break over that anyway. With major releases, I think it's very important that users know that there's an upgrade. We find many times that our users that are still on Firefox 2 just didn't know that Firefox 3 had been released. Somehow they missed the dialogue, even if we've pushed up an announcement 2 or 3 times to all the users. Somehow they missed it because maybe their mom was using the computer or someone else was using the computer and just clicked cancel because they didn't know if that they wanted the upgrade. So it's very important that users know that there's an upgrade, and it should also be very easy to do the upgrade. The easy part is something that we decided very early on in Firefox, that it should be almost transparent. The user should just, at the most, have to click a yes button. If the user has to download and install and go through an entire process again, that you immediately drop a big hunk of users. If you can't do it in 2-3 seconds, you've lost a bunch of users already. So whether to push automatically major releases, we're still debating. There's definitely users that want both ways. And I also think it's very important that users are in control. If users don't want to upgrade, they should be able to, at all times, make a conscious decision and say, I don't want more upgrades, for whatever reason there may be.
So there's another issue, right? My father-in-law is 82 years old, and his computer is not quite as old as he is, but it runs Windows 98, because it turns out that I couldn't find a Linux distribution easily available that would fit on the machine. And it also turns out that I can only find one browser that's a modern browser that will fit into the machine. There's a lot of this stuff around. So, wanting everybody to have the latest everything, it's like, one solution is go out and buy the whole world the latest piece of hardware to run it. But that's probably not the best way we could spend all our money. So you've got to actually recognize that some of these limits come from things that are quite important to people, and things that are pretty fundamental.
So looking at the composition of this panel, I'm noticing 2 major absences. Our friends at Apple and Microsoft are not here, which collectively have more than about 50% of the browser market share, if I have the recent stats right. What are you doing to work well with the entire browser community to make sure that as a new and important standard gets out, it gets implemented across all the major browsers so that web developers can count on that feature being there when they're deploying their website in the real world?
I find a very important part is in the standards process. When you're defining a new standard, it's very important to have all the parties that have interest in the standard and are going to implement the standard to have them involved so that they can give input. First of all, I think if you don't have a party involved, it's very easy to accidentally put something in the standard that someone just can't implement. It's just physically too hard. Some of those things are actually already on the web, unfortunately, but so there's that aspect. The other thing is that it's just if someone just throws a standard in your lap and says here, go implement it, then you'll be much less excited to do that than if you get to be part of the development process. You get to give your input. You get to put your print on it. So that way you'll be more excited about then going forward and implementing it. So I think getting all browser vendors involved in the standards community is very important.
So are you working with Microsoft and Apple directly on these standards today? Is that process working well?
It's nice to know that Apple is involved in standards stuff, much more than they're in anywhere else. It's a pain in the ass when it turns out that they're involved because they sent their patent declaration and said, we're going to block all of this stuff, and we've got to figure out a way around dealing with that. But in general, these other browsers are actually involved in standards development. I think another important thing that we do is compete, right? Each browser has users. Each browser has developers who are pushing what they want to do and following the latest file I/O and interactivity stuff in Opera or the latest stuff in Firefox or Chrome or whatever. And because we're actually competing with each other as well, we're looking around and seeing, what is it that attracts these people to some other browser? And part of it is the new functionalities that they develop. The fact that Firefox and IE and Opera and Apple and Chrome and other browsers that no one here knows of all have active communities and support them and get them developing stuff keeps all of us on our toes. It makes us look around and say, well, we've got to follow that as well. We've got to actually figure out, is that something that's worth standardizing, that's worth doing across the web, or is this some weird thing that's going to die off in a corner? And when a browser comes up with something and makes it work, it's great. If you take it and say, look, we want to standardize this, it helps the browser, it helps the developer community, and it helps the other browsers have a reason to sit down and talk to each other.
I think we should point out that everyone up here, first of all, we're nice people, but we do try to be as open and as we do as much outreach as we can. So when we're developing something like Canvas 3D or O3D, we tend not to see it as some whiz-bang advantage that's going to get more usage for our browser and get people to switch from other browsers because only we are going to support O3D or Canvas 3D. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is figure out how do we move the web forward. And so when we do things like Canvas 3D, there was a very active effort. Arun from Mozilla was reaching out trying to see, okay, how do we get people from Google? How do we get people from Opera and Microsoft? And how do we get all the people to the same table and talk about this so that when we're actually developing this, we know about the issues ahead of time. We don't want to get to a point where we have a spec and 2 years later, the other browsers who weren't the first to start implementing and realize, oh my gosh, this doesn't work in a multi-process model, or oh my gosh, we can't do this on top of DirectX because the OpenGL shader language is different. Or, we do try to reach out as early as we can because we want to know if there are these sorts of issues that are going to hold us up. Sometimes it's unfortunate when we find out these issues, be they patent issues or technical issues, because sometimes there's setbacks and we want to get things done quickly. But I think that we all realize that it's much better for us to find this out early in the process as opposed to at the end of the process. So I think we're all trying to be as open as we can.
Yeah, the whole implementing a standard in order to compete kind of doesn't work. I've never heard of any user switching to Firefox because we support animated ping, for example. That people switch to browsers because because websites work nicely, because the browser works nicely with the user. Generally speaking, most sites write such that they work in all browsers. So that's generally speaking, but there's very few times that I'll switch or someone switches to a browser because it has some new standard. If a standard only works in one browser, no site is going to rely on it anyway, generally speaking. So there's no competitive advantage there, really, for users.
Well, so there's not for users, but there's an advantage for developers, right?
Yes.
Developers want to figure out how to play with the new technology. And in order for developers to experiment with the new technology, they do go from one set of new technology to another, figure out what they like. And it's not that implementing this feature is going to get my mum to switch a browser. But it will give a developer a place to experiment. So there's standardization and there's innovation, and they're separate processes. Right? Innovation is where you start building the experiment. Standardization is where you've seen the experiments and what people have done with it, and you've said, yeah, we need to actually make this work properly, and yeah, then we take a step back and we get it all right, and we make sure it works on mobiles and in Arabic and in Japanese with vertical text and in dual processor systems. And so the innovation stuff that drives the creativity and the development comes back down to standardization at a different level. So I agree that you don't win users because you implement some standard thing, but you do get creativity, you get innovation, you get a chance for people to make applications.
So if you're not, if you're not competing on the standard on the web platform, what's the pitch from each of you in terms of why I, as a newbie user, should use Opera, Firefox, or Chrome, and why are you competing in the market? Why not join efforts into one super browser project where you pool your efforts into building the latest and greatest web rendering engine?
So
because we'd have to downsize all the engineers, right? I mean,
Yeah, we don't like each other that.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it's not that we don't, we do sort of compete. Like, things like JavaScript, there was a slide in the keynote that showed how fast JavaScript had gotten. If there weren't multiple browsers, I don't know that curve would be as sharp as it is. Within the past year, we've seen JavaScript in all the major browsers make leaps and bounds. And I think that, part of this is us competing for developer love. Part of it is just, if you're a user and you're loading Gmail, which is getting more complex as more features get added in, you want that to load quickly. And if you start realizing that, it's taking 10 seconds in my browser to load, but when I switch to Google Chrome, it comes up in 1 second, maybe then that's going to convince the user to switch over. So, we're not trying to compete in terms of these are standards I'm going to implement, these are standards I'm not going to implement, but we are certainly competing in terms of user experience. How well do we render the web? How shiny is our browser? How nice does it look? How does it feel to use this overall?
A lot of the pitch is, the browser makes your life better, right? The more the browser helps you do the things you're actually trying to do, because very, very few people in the world have a job of using a browser. It's like most of their job is use the browser to do something, and making that thing work better for them is a big bunch of where we compete. Why do we not all do the same thing? Yeah, I agree with him. We would stagnate. We had the fastest JavaScript engine around for ages, and we didn't do a lot of work on it because nobody else cared about speed in JavaScript. And so nothing happened. And then all of a sudden people said, wait a minute, they started building these heavy Ajax apps, and JavaScript became important, and we push each other. We have engineers are individuals, and groups are slightly different with different cultures. They're interested in slightly different stuff. They compete. People like competing. So a race to build the fastest JavaScript engine is much more fun when there's more than one entrant, because a one-person race is kind of dull to watch and not much fun to participate in.
Yeah. I mean, the performance is definitely an important aspect of how we compete. There's also like user experience, stability. It's basically the interface towards users are a major competitive point. Like, do I like the Chrome UI and the features that Chrome provides, or do I like the Firefox UI or the Opera UI? So sort of how you interact with the browser, which browser you feel comfortable with, that's more of a competitive vector. Also, performance has gotten very, very important lately. I think there's just been some sort of critical mass behind the performance message, and also websites have gotten so complex that they actually get to be slower, and so that's why people care about performance these days much more than we did just a few years ago.
So speaking of JavaScript engines, between the 2-3x year-over-year improvements in JavaScript speed and new standards like worker threads, which allows me to do background processing without locking up the main UI, there's a lot more power on the client than there used to be. Like, by some benchmarks, the JS engines are faster than many other interpreted languages like PHP or Python. If I'm a web developer and I'm re-architecting my site or building a new site from scratch, and I'm making a key decision, which is how much work do I do on the client versus the server, or which work do I do on the client or the server? What's your advice to me on how to figure that out?
Carefully.
Make it modular. The nice thing about a good modular design is that it should be pretty easy to take some module, some part of that, and shift it over. So I would say that if you want to be really forward-looking and think, okay, how do I take advantage of what's coming up in browsers in the next few years? How do I take advantage of speed? How do I take advantage of new features? Design your code in such a way that if there is a part that you think might be separable, write it in such a way such that 2 years from now, if it might make more sense to do it on the client, it's easy to swap it out. Don't write it as just one giant monolithic PHP file that is one class, one function. That's going to hurt, and that's just good coding practice in general.
And there's a general coding rule that's something like too early optimizations is the root of all evil, and that's like if you start thinking about performance and start doing performance before you actually have anything else, and then you are probably gonna optimize things that you don't need to optimize, and it's much better to optimize for code quality so that once you have something working and you can see what is slow, at that point you can optimize that. There's also the case that the web platform changes extremely rapidly right now. So whatever is the correct answer now is not going to be the correct answers in 2 years. So you better be prepared. You better build your code such that you can easily change it.
You also want to think about, the web platform is not like a single platform. The difference between a small device, a Nintendo DS, which is a pretty low-spec machine compared to some shiny new laptop. You don't necessarily want the code to run the same way on both things. So keep it simple. One thing, just cut it down if you can and figure out, as Ian says, work out where you can shift stuff across from one to the other. Keep your code flexible so you can deal with the changes.
I think a lot of the advice that we've heard over the years, especially when CSS started coming out, people were like, you need to be really good about separating your program logic from your presentation layer from your data. Had you done that, you'd be in a much better state right now, because when mobile started taking off, you could say, well, I've got my application code, that's still pretty much the same. My data isn't really changing that much, but my presentation layer sort of needs to change for mobile. So that transition might not have been quite as painful for you. Now that we're talking about offline, if all of your stuff is server-side, all your presentation logic is server-side, and now you're trying to move that offline, that's going to be hard. But had you separated that a few years ago, you could say, well, okay, now some part of that is moving down to the client, but I've already got this nice separation, so there's a layer I can rewrite. So I think a lot of the advice that people have been giving for years still applies.
And I go back to the carefully thing, because it's like, it's not enough to say, well, I have all this stuff in CSS and HTML and JavaScript, I've got all this separation. It's how you actually conceive of the stuff, it's how it fits together. Because you can write one huge piece of code that is actually very cleanly and beautifully structured in your understanding of how it works, and you can simply pull pieces out and put them in. And you can write stuff that's got modules all over the place where, in fact, the modules are just this giant spaghetti stuff connecting things.
So this is great general advice. Can you think of specific examples you could point people at where you think people are taking advantage of the next generation JavaScript engines or offline or worker threads to do things in a way that we maybe wouldn't have built web applications before? It's a good example for me as a web developer to see. Here's an example of how you could use some of these next-gen technologies.
I thought it was pretty cool the other day when because I use to read email on my phone. I use Safari and Gmail. Because I used iPhone. And it was pretty cool when a few months ago or a few weeks ago, all of a sudden the UI changed and became much snappier. And it turned out that it was because they're using the client-side SQL API. And so I don't know exactly how the caching works, but many times instead of having to download all your emails, it has them already on the phone. So it was noticeably more snappier. They're still working on some bugs because oftentimes you end up seeing too old emails and you have to manually refresh it. So there's definitely still bugs there, but it's a very interesting sort of first draft or first take on improving performance by using these new APIs.
And I think that the current trend towards using web toolkits, be that Gwt or other toolkits out there, as it becomes possible to do more things on the client or do things in different ways. For instance, if some code that you compiled in Gwt would now run better were you using a worker thread, that change can be made in the toolkit so that you as an application developer might not even have to do anything. We as the toolkit provider could make that change. So I think that if you're able to use a toolkit, not only does that help you do some abstraction and clean code, but it also helps other people help you. So not to sort of be all Google here, but things like Gwt are certainly a good way to go.
So last question from me, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience. So we have a microphone on this side and a microphone on this side. If you want to ask our panel questions, please come on up to one of the microphones, and we'll get you part of the discussion. So my last question, many of you mentioned mobile. Let's be honest, the browser state on mobile is a total mess. I'm sure you've seen lots of blog posts from people looking at state of implementation of different standards across different devices and phones. As a web developer, it's really hard to understand exactly how to understand this landscape and how to support, if I want to support 1 billion people on all of these different phones, it's a gargantuan effort to do it. So what are all of you doing to help us clean up the mobile mess and get a better set of supported standardized browsers across mobile devices?
Making better mobile browsers.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. It's just hard work.
I think the big problem on mobile, I've not done any mobile development myself, but from what I've heard, the big problem is that there's just so many players there. It has been so easy to build like a crappy browser and put it on mobile phones, and then people try to use it. Whereas instead of building like a full-fledged web browser, which that's what we at Mozilla is definitely pushing as answer to how do you do a mobile web is let's just put the normal web on the mobile web. Let's put full web browsers that have all capabilities of desktop browsers on cell phones. Like doing something cut down that's a very short-sighted solution. People want to use all manners of web pages that aren't mobilized yet. And in order to do that, you need a full web browser. And also, web developers want to use all the features that they've become accustomed to use on desktop. So they also want a full browser.
I think people are also voting with their feet. People meaning both end users, but also phone manufacturers. So right now, we see a huge sale of iPhones. I see a lot of people in the room with Androids. I'm not sure why that is. I hear they gave some out. But if you look at these browsers, if you look at these phones, they all have pretty full-featured web browsers. Both iPhone and Android browser happen to be based off of WebKit, which is sort of cool for me because a lot of the work that we do on the Google Chrome team, we just check straight into WebKit, which means that not only does it end up in Safari on the desktop, but also ends up in the Safari browser on iPhone. It ends up in the Android browser. So I think WebKit is actually doing a lot of great things for mobile browsers. Certainly, the Opera guys have a ton of experience on making good mobile browsers, and people are voting with their feet when they go and download Opera Mini for their phone. So I think that voting with your feet is also a great way to sort of encourage people to do better in the browser space. If you're looking at buying a new phone, buy one that comes with a good browser.
Yeah.
Or buy a good browser.
Just get a good browser. Download Opera Mini. If you've got an old crappy phone, one of the issues is phone systems have been pretty closed. Phone operators have been reluctant to allow people to just install whatever they want and do whatever they want with their phone, and they've been pretty tight about what could go there. And phones last a long time. The people who go out and buy a new phone every year are a fairly small shim on top of the market, and the phones are out there. If you go around the markets around the world, you find 10-year-old phones all over the place. Millions and millions and millions are sold every week of 10-year-old phones. So part of the issue is we have this legacy, and working out how to build systems for old devices, how to bring not the sort of 20 or 50 million richest people in the world to go out and buy the fanciest new thing, but the billion or two who haven't got the fanciest new thing and also haven't got a desktop computer and are going to use the web on their phone and will use whatever works on their phone. we've got to deal with that because that's a huge part of what makes up the market.
You want to step up to the mic? You had a question for the panel?
Yeah, sure. I'm Vinny from PGP Corporation. You guys know us from encrypting mail and data content and stuff like that. I have an interesting observation, and I've noticed this over the last, 7 years, 8 years. As more and more of the content has been moving up onto the clouds, into the web, the fear that I have is that that content isn't very well protected. Now, when I say protected to a browser developer, they tend to say to me, well, sure we are. We do SSL, TLS, or whatever, and we protect the data going up and down. But what I'm thinking about, and what I hear often from, the CSOs, the chief security officers, the technology officers, folks like the FBI, people who care about the data itself, is that the data itself is not protected. Let me give you two cases in point, and I'll show you. I'll offer you a possible solution. Most companies that have very, very savvy chief security officers will not let them use iPhones to access their mail system. They won't let them use Gmail because there's no way to encrypt that data. Right? I can't send an email through Gmail and encrypt it and worry about it being decrypted. Yeah, the pipe is protected, but that data is out of their reach. Another good example is, and I've seen this happen a lot now. I've seen companies move their data offline. We used some third party to do performance reviews for employees. And it was interesting to see that they were typing all the stuff about what the employees were going to do next year into this offsite website. Well, I said, well, gee, did you vet the employees of that offsite website? How do you know that that data is not well protected? So again, I've seen this trend of things moving up there onto the web and people doing backups offsite. Now, we've done a couple of hacks over the years. I've tried to address this, done some NP API plugins, maybe thought about using embed to specify that data that is embedded is encrypted, and that only the clients can look at those things. But if you look at the Android phones and you look at the...
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I'm saying that if you look at the Android phones and the iPhones and the stuff, those browsers don't really offer you any way to extend them to identify that data should be secure. What I'd like to see happen with the browsers, and maybe with HTML and whatever, is for you to start thinking about how to encrypt, how to specify that data be encrypted. Again, my fear is that, people wonder about things like Facebook. They say, gee, I put these photos up there, but then Facebook can look at it or somebody else can look at it. I'd like to be able to encrypt that data as a customer and only let my friends who have the right keys look at that. That's my open-ended question.
I think one of the problems with encryption that we've seen so far, there was this great sort of seminal paper a few years ago called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt, which was a great usability, I think it was called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt.
Pretty old, yeah.
Great usability study on PGP 5, I think. And
we're at 10.
Yes, you're at 10. But one of the things that came up is it's very hard to actually figure out how to teach users what to do. Encryption is not something that people naturally think of. I'll buy the argument that people might want to protect their email. That's a very logical thing to do. They might want to protect what they put on Facebook. But I think that one of the first things that really needs to be worked out before we go down the path of standardizing PGP into the browser is figuring out how do we actually make this usable? How do we, show me that users are actually, there is a good UI for doing this, that users want this, that there is large demand. I'm pretty sure that you could do this in JavaScript with a Chrome extension if you wanted to. That might be a radical statement, but JavaScript performance has gotten really good. It's a Turing-complete language, so given enough time, you probably should be able to do it. If someone showed me a very compelling UI that would let someone in Gmail or on Facebook easily say, encrypt this content and only let my friends see it, and they worked out all the user experience issues and said, Ian, I've solved it. Here it is. That would be very compelling for me. Right now, I think those UX issues are still unresolved. I don't mean to demean any particular product or implementation, but I think we have a long way to go before my mother can figure out how to send an encrypted email to me.
So let me retort to you that a lot of stuff has happened since that paper was written, and that I'd say about 90% of the corporate Fortune 100 is using, in fact, our product. Okay. Yes, I agree with you. I'd like to see something like embed, encrypted text, something key, whatever. Leave that up to the implementers. It should be a control panel no one ever sees. But those questions are being solved.
So the questions are being asked. At the beginning, when I said the exciting technology was all this access to sensitive information, and it's exciting because it's not a technology question. The security stuff is not about can we encrypt stuff. We know how to do that. It really is about how do we get people to understand what they're doing, and how do we get them to think about it. And it's really, really complicated. And every time you get it wrong, if you train a micro-generation of users to do something that turns out to be a bad idea, then you've taken this huge step backwards. We have all this certificate stuff where all of the browsers say, well, we've got this certificate and it's unsigned and it's low security and it doesn't really work. Do you want to continue putting your credit card number? What do we all do?
Yes.
Yes, and we are the experts, right? And we take this huge backward step. We have learned to do the stupid thing. So we've got to figure out, as we get this right, we've got to figure out how to do it in a way that teaches users and in a way that users understand what they're doing, how to do the right thing. So the research is not technology. The research and the development is behavior, and the web is a very, very big environment. Researching behavior and people's understanding on the web, that's complicated stuff.
Good question.
And we're doing it.
My question is regarding with the increase in touch and multi-touch as a user interface, not only for mobile devices but also laptops and computers. That has an implication for how you might use the web browser, the features of the web browser, and how you might design for it. I mean, even with the iPhone, it has multi-touch features, but it also stops it from doing some other types of interface. I'd like to hear your comments on what would you regard as sort of the best practice for dealing with a sort of new touch and multi-touch environment and user interface.
We've had recent discussions with a vendor, I'm not sure if I can tell you who, but about coming out with DOM APIs, new standards for doing multi-touch and so on. But there is one of the early problems we discovered as we started doing mobile stuff, this is a long time ago, not the current effort, was that when you went to Gmaps, to Google Maps, and you wanted to scroll on the map, instead of scrolling the map, what you ended up was scrolling the page. And so there is a effort, the DOM events effort, to try to standardize this better, because, like you say, there's overlap in the various ways you interact with the browser, and so it's not a solved problem yet. There are various solutions, and they are being debated. I haven't heard where that standard is, what the latest news on that standard is, but there is definitely efforts there to sort of improve the situation.
Who's supposed to be working on it,
yeah, you can
sitting over there hiding instead.
No, so it's a very hard problem to solve, especially the fact that today there's so many things that want to react to on click, whereas if you're dragging with a touch on a touch interface, that is sort of a click but sort of not, and how does the page or browser know which one you want to do? So I suspect that there's slowly going to come new standards to deal with this, and then once the standards have been slowly deployed, websites will slowly start to take advantage of them. It's not the best way. The best help here is going to be when the more people start mobile browsing, so the more this turns into an actual problem for people and for websites, the faster we'll find a solution.
Right. There's this legacy of dirty, messy code that is causing problems, and everything we try and do gets complicated by the fact that there's a whole chunk of the web out there that will break if we do anything that seems intelligent. And so, if you guys go back and figure out how to clean up your stuff, then that would be helpful. That will be a part of the best practice that will enable us to build, us all, because developers do most of the thinking here, to build new best practices and make things go. But interfaces change all the time. Control interfaces touch and multi-touch and gravity stuff. And you go into the accessibility world where you have people with disabilities who've been using brainwave control, literally, and voice and multi-touch stuff for years and decades. There's a lot of this stuff around. It's about figuring out how to integrate it, and it's really about how can we clean up the way that people understand the interaction piece of an application so that we can make nicer code and nicer APIs available without busting half the web.
How do you see the future and the role of browser extensions?
I think browser extension. I mean, to me, the browser is really once you have installed a browser, it's your piece of software. You should be able to do whatever you want with it, and so the more powerful extensions that are available for that browser, the better. So I'm definitely very pro browser and pro extensions. I mean, look at the extension community we have for Firefox. It's really amazing, and I'm sure a good chunk of the reason people switch to Firefox is because there's some extension that they want. The downside or the other side of that is security. We want people to be secure at the same time, and the more sort of power we give to extensions, the more things they can do, the more awesome they get. The bigger the risk that they do something evil and bad, or the risk that they have some security problem in them and someone hacks them, and then you have full access to whatever power that they had. So I definitely think that extensions are a very good thing, and we just need to sort of, it's not a perfect system yet, and it's never going to be a perfect system, but we need to improve, and we need to make it more secure and easier to deal with. The other side, too, is the Grease Monkey type extensions where you actually extend web pages. And that's one of the things I think where HTML has really triumphed, in the sense that you could never do something like Grease Monkey for your desktop applications. Like the applications I install on my iPhone are never going to have like a Grease Monkey plugin that allow me to like improve the applications. But the websites I use are the system, the sort of the ecosystem around the web is such that you can reach into various aspects. You can change the looks of things, and you can also add functionality or change functionality as you want. So that is a very powerful thing of the web, and I think that's, I don't know if there'll be a major competitive advantage to the web as opposed to desktop applications, but it's definitely something that for the people that use it, it's a very powerful thing.
At the beginning of the talk, we were talking about, how do you as a browser decide what to implement? And I think it was Charles who said, if you go out there and you show that there's a need for it and a lot of people want it, then we'll implement it. I think extensions provide a way to show that need. So, a few years ago, when phishing was just sort of entering the common vocabulary, Google went out and put on an extension for Firefox, the safe browsing extension, which basically provided warnings when you hit a suspected phishing site. And now that functionality is in all the browsers. Why? Because we showed that we could do it. People started downloading it and showed there was a demand for it. And it was validated as a reasonable idea. And so now it's one of the standard things in most browsers. So I think extensions have a great role in not only just customizing your browser to meet your experience, but also in validating that something is a good idea for a browser and that there is demand for it and that it should become part of the standard browsing experience.
So extensibility gives a community a chance to either show where a browser should go or take something, a lot of the stuff that we've done at Opera that's like mouse gestures and things we've had for ages, speed dials and stuff, people go and develop as Firefox extensions. It gives you this quick way of copying stuff or of testing stuff out. It suffers from some drawbacks. You don't want your core functionality to be based on some chain of extensibility because the inherent difference in security and stuff. So you want to use that as a way of seeing where people are going, what's good, as a guide to what should you bring into the central core. But extensibility in general, it's a programming paradigm, right? Helps people do stuff.
Specifically, what functional or design patents have inhibited, I guess, the development and implementation of new browser standards?
You mean by number or just like the author and date?
In general, like, I guess, what have you run into where maybe Apple or Microsoft has said, nope, can't do that, or do it differently?
I think some of it, some of your question is alluding to, like, are people saying, no, don't do that? But I think a lot of it is just practical constraints, at least on the Chrome side. Like, we look at things like web workers, and it seems like that should be so trivial to implement in Chrome. But then we hit all these issues like, to do XHR from a worker, you need to know the origin of the request. Simple thing. But when you're in multi-process land, like you are in Chrome, you are in a separate process, you might not actually have access to that data. So on the Chrome side, we actually hit a lot of these practical considerations that, before we released, people developing these standards weren't necessarily thinking, how is this actually going to play out in a multi-process environment? And now people are actually starting to think about that, and so I don't know if that's functional or, but that's one of the things that is certainly interesting from my perspective in terms of things that sound like they should be easy but actually turn out to be quite hard.
So was your question about patterns or patents?
I meant patents.
Patents.
Yes, like
Sorry.
So,
registered patents.
Well, the first thing I think when you say patents is video. The video situation right now is really, really bad, in the sense that there's all sort of ridiculous patents out there, and the most popular format and arguably a very good format is H.264. We just can't use because there's patents on it. There's just no way, and we would love to do it. There's code out there. There's open source code out there. We could just plug it in. But we can't technically and financially do it because of patents. And similarly, everything around video is so heavily patented that Apple has said that, well, OGG looks decent enough, but if we implement it, we have no idea if we're going to get sued, because there's very likely that there's a patent somewhere that no one has thought about, or that might be a submarine patent that no one knows about yet. And so they just, out of fear of getting sued, they don't want to implement it. And no one knows of a patent, but there's probably a patent, or quite possibly a patent.
Do you see a solution for these kind of problems?
So walking into any new area of technology, every time the web goes into some new area of technology, you find that in most areas of technology there are patents. And some companies, I don't know of Microsoft holding a patent over anybody to stop development of the web at any time ever. And I do know of them before the sort of W3C patent policy, which was a fairly radical step of saying, we want people to make a royalty-free web. We want the stuff to be patent-free if we can. Microsoft voluntarily stepped up and said, we've got this patent, and we will put it down on the conditions which are, what are now the W3C conditions. In things like voice, going into voice, as Jonas said, video is a minefield. Going into a couple of areas, there have been patents. Apple is currently excluding a patent on the widget space. And the solution is that we sit down and we look either with the patent holder, because people file patents and it costs them money, and they do have a right to say, I want to actually recoup some of the money I got from this work. But you can either sit down with the patent holder and say, well, all right, if we're going to do this, either we agree to all pay up money, and in the sort of W3C world, that's not an answer. It's like we've got to figure out a way around it. So Apple can come and help us work out how to avoid infringing their patent and still provide a functionality that's the thing we were aiming at. Or we go out to the community and say, look, we're not getting anywhere. We've got to figure this out as a community, and it's a big, complicated process. It's like, what is the history behind this patent? What other patents are out there that might cover something, an expired patent that covers similar stuff that we could use, or some prior art that shows the patent holder that actually it's not really worth their while enforcing this. And in the past, in some cases, that's what's happened. That someone has said, we've got patents on this sort of scene updating technology or something, and we sit down and we can't make any headway, and we go out and start looking around, and people say, wait a minute, you got the patent, but like 10 years before you ever applied for it, there were 15 applications doing it, and the patent holder looks at it and says, yeah, you're right, don't worry about it, just go ahead and use it.
So we're just about out of time, or we are out of time. Quick closing remarks from each of you. We'll start with you, Ian. Any thoughts you have for the audience?
I'm very excited by the direction that browsers are going. I think all the browsers, both on stage and off stage, are getting better. And I know that we're all very motivated to continue that direction. We're all providing a lot of new functionality. I hope that you all in the audience start taking advantage of it, and certainly give us feedback. And if there's a direction that you think that we should be going in that we're not, let us know.
Yeah, I'm very excited that the web is changing, has changed a lot over the past few years. Just a few years ago, nothing was basically happening. The web had looked the same for a few years, and there was no new significant innovation. And now we have 5 major browsers that are very heavily competing with each other, and the improvements that's happened in JavaScript are very sort of indicative of how much competition and how much improvement we're actually seeing. So I'm very excited to be part of this.
So it's exciting. It's like, we're in this brave new world. One of the things that I see more of and would like to see a lot more of is professionalism. Let's get together and let's do our work on our own and make it better, because the web started off being a bunch of cowboys and a bunch of crazy people doing stuff and just lashing it up. And there is a place for that, and we should all remember that if you don't do that, you stagnate and get bored and go off and become a mechanic or a plumber or something. But there is also a place for being professional and caring about quality and caring about maintaining stuff, thinking about stuff that's going to be around when you're not working on it anymore and where it goes. And I see that there is a whole lot more of that, and I'd like to see even more. The browsers are getting better. I mean, browsers used to be this sort of crazy project that you'd lash together. Now they're turning into an important piece of software, and we're working harder on making it a really good piece of software. The developers are getting better. Developers are actually thinking harder about what impact they have and what impact it has when they do a good job, and what impact it has when they think about stuff that's going to be maybe around for a long time, or how they're going to change it so that their embarrassing first effort, which is always my case, doesn't stick around, that it gets replaced by something cleaner and better. Because it's fun.
I want to thank the panel for great thoughts on browser futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you.